Under the Skin focuses on a subject who is the object of desire. The film's protagonist, unnamed in the film and who, for the sake of this video, we'll nickname simply as the woman, is, on the surface, a very attractive woman. But under the skin, literally, she's something else. Something ambiguously inhuman. There's an important narrative trick that makes Under the Skin such a profound piece. It happens about halfway in. The film frames the woman throughout the first half as primarily an object, objectifying camera angles, emphasis on how she's affecting the men who gaze upon her, etc. But this changes, and it changes somewhat abruptly. The woman breaks free from the captivity she's been held under, and then she starts to discover her own wants, needs, and interests. She goes from object to subject. We start to see the world through her perspective more and more. There's a great scene which characterizes the first half of Under the Skin. It's when the woman is walking through a mall in Glasgow. The film focuses on her body, framing her from behind to portray her as an object. We see people walk by her, some people taking notice of her attractiveness, while most simply pass her by. The woman is the feminine object of society. Beautiful, sexually appealing, and devoid of any autonomy or any suggestion of an inner subjectivity. She exists to be attractive, and that's it. And that's not subtext. That's the premise of the film. We see before this that the woman is being controlled by handlers of unknown origin. It appears that she was either manufactured or brought from out of this world to put on the appearance of a beautiful woman, for reasons that aren't yet clear at this point in the story. The woman's handlers retrieve the body of a woman that they found in a ditch on the side of the road. The woman strips the dead woman of her clothes and puts them on herself. These clothes are the same ones that she wears in the mall. This is important for understanding the mall scene. We know at this point a few things. The woman isn't a human, she's involved in some kind of dark trafficking scenario, and she's wearing the clothes of a dead woman in public. In the mall scene, you see that she's contrasted from everyone else in the mall for a number of reasons. Her body language, her framing and emphasis in the shot, and importantly, how she's dressed. It goes without saying that she's stunning, but her beauty isn't one associated with traditional glamour. Instead, it's the beauty that is more typically stereotyped as, for lack of a better word, whorish. She looks like a sex worker, and this is absolutely intentional because the woman is, in part, meant to be analogous to a sex worker. Her actual role is to pick up male strangers and entice them into having sex with her, at which point they'll become trapped and have their biological material harvested for some reason never stated in the film. Thus, she has to present herself as an ideal sex object, both alluring and available to male strangers. Sex worker fashion has to exist in two spaces simultaneously, the public space and the workspace. They have to simultaneously attract clients with their appearance and how they conduct themselves, but also not rouse enough suspicion from onlookers that they risk getting into legal trouble. The woman strikes this balance with her manner of dress. This means that she fits a particular kind of feminine status. I've alluded in other videos to the concept of the ideal feminine. This is an intentionally vague phrase, so let me clarify. When I say ideal feminine, there isn't any objective societal standard upon which ideal femininity is based. It's amorphous and ever-changing. I've said in my video on Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me that there are two contrasting images of femininity that affected that film's protagonist, Laura Palmer, the virgin and the whore. These images are what are called controlling images in sociology. Controlling images are social ideas of people based on their social status or category that are used to control their behaviors. If a woman is viewed as virginal, this can be used simultaneously to prevent women from being able to express sexuality, but can also be used to accuse women of being prudish so that they'll feel pressure to have sex. This is how the virgin image of women can be used to control them, but the image of the whore can have the same effect. And unambiguously, this is a big piece of the story of Under the Skin. The woman is not just any woman, she's a whore. And she is the ideal whore because she seems to have no autonomy or inner world beyond irresistible lust for whatever man will seek her out. We learn that, in spite of her status as an ideal whore, she's actually highly predatory. After she convinces men to sleep with her, she takes them to a remote location where she traps them in some sort of black void. She's implied in these early scenes to be a sexual predator, albeit one who is under the control of handlers. These quote-unquote sex scenes are some of the most evocative scenes of the film and are highly disturbing and surreal, but they serve a number of purposes. They reinforce her nature as truly alien. They also portray her as villainous in a way that will become recontextualized in the later half of the film. Importantly, they mimic the actual visual language of the mall scene from earlier. Before, we were the onlooker, gazing at her body while she walks through the mall. The same subtext of seduction follows her into these black void scenes, but this time we see that she is now the object of interest for specific men who are seeking her out. These scenes take on a similar general shape every time. She always brings them into some remote location, at which point they enter into a black void, where she entices them with her attractiveness, usually removing her clothes one at a time while walking away from them, sometimes turning away, other times facing them. In these moments, she is both active and passive. She has all of the control, but she performs a role of being pursued rather than being the pursuer. Rather than aggressing on them, she waits for them to catch up to her, but they never do. In these moments, she's quote-unquote playing hard to get, to quote a cliche. She clearly implies that she wants them to pursue her, but it's all part of the trap. They begin to slowly descend into the black void. Once they're trapped, like a Venus flytrap, she puts her clothes back on and leaves. These scenes evoke a certain patriarchal logic. The idea of a woman who ruins men with her beauty through manipulation. She promised them sex, but tricked them. This narrative is used to suggest that women, by their very nature, are predatory towards men because of their beauty and sexual desirability. So then when we compare the visual language between the mall scene and the black void scenes, the parallel becomes apparent, suggesting that her very nature as an attractive, sexualized woman in public implies a predatory, anti-male nature. And this is the flip side of the coin for the controlling image of the whore. When someone is the ideal whore, they are sexually available in a way that men desire. But when the coin flips, sexualized women can easily become sexualized in a way that men find repulsive or deserving of scorn. In the film, the woman's actions are characterized as explicitly predatory. She even drives around in a white van picking men up, conjuring up a traditionally masculinized idea of sexual predation. At the same time, she's tricking these men into the promise of sex and then destroying them, fitting a traditionally feminized image of sexual predation, that of the evil seductress. But throughout the first act of the film, the woman's actions are contextualized via the implication of trafficking. She has handlers who are manipulating her every move. They're forcing her to do this, and we see very little in the way of subjectivity for her character. We don't know if she wants to do this or not. Does she get any joy from this? Does she even experience joy to begin with? This isn't made clear. But prior to the second act, we can discern that something is off, that she isn't the villainess that the film conditions us to accept her as with its visual language. What she's doing is horrific, but she clearly has no choice. The turning point that leads us into the second act is when she finds a man on the street with a significant facial deformity. This man has never been with a woman as beautiful as her, and likely doesn't have good odds of attracting a woman generally. He treats her well and is kind to her, but this makes it all the more horrifying when she begins doing her same act to trick him into sex that she did with the others. If she had an inner conscience, our minds tell us to say that she would know better, that she would stop and let this man go free. But we don't even understand who or what she is. We don't know if we should expect her to have an inner conscience, or to even be capable of having one at any point. But it ultimately shouldn't matter. We should recognize at this point that she's a victim of trafficking. She has no autonomy. We don't know the extent to which she can break with what is expected of her by her handlers. And so we watch with horror as she attempts to claim the life of a much more innocent and downtrodden man than any of the men we've seen lust after her so far. She ultimately decides to let the man go, suggesting the possibility of a conscience. Her exact motivation is unclear, but we get a little hint at a change in her perception when she sees herself in a mirror inside of the house she brings him to. It's at this pivotal moment when the woman goes from object to subject. We understand when the woman looks in the mirror that whatever she is, she has some sense of an inner world. She has self-awareness, and to some extent, a sense of self-concept. But this self-concept is extremely vague and distorted, because when she sees herself in the mirror, she sees a woman. And that's something that she just isn't. She escapes the clutches of her handlers, goes to the countryside, and begins trying to live life outside of the context of her captivity. She seems to have no concept of reality outside of being trafficked, which suggests to me that she may have been created or possibly raised by her handlers. After breaking free, one of her first moves is to go to a nice restaurant and order some cake. It's at this point that it's apparent that she's never lived a normal human life or anything approximating it. She seems to want to see what this strange world has to offer. She attempts to eat the cake but ends up spitting it out, apparently incapable of digesting human food. She doesn't get to enjoy even the most basic element of being a human, reinforcing for her and the audience that whatever she is, it isn't human. My favorite section of the film is shortly after this, when she meets a man on the bus. He's a bit older than the Johns that she's been used to, but he doesn't treat her like a whore. He treats her like a human being. He helps her stay warm, he tries to cook for her, gives her a place to stay. They go out together. She's clearly very strange, quiet, and aloof, but he takes a liking to her regardless. This is normalcy. Even though the circumstances are strange, she gets to experience the realities of being a woman outside of the context of being a trafficking victim. She gets to experience a domestic life, a romantic connection, comfort, safety, and security. One night, we see the woman staring at herself naked in the mirror. No joy, no relief or comfort. Instead, just that same self-alienated look of nothingness. None of these domestic experiences or positive experiences of femininity have altered her inability to see herself as a true woman. Nothing has changed. She's still not human. This culminates in one of their final moments together. She begins having sex with the man, seemingly consensually and definitely with no implication of some sort of trickery or entrapment. This is just a moment of true intimacy. And yet she rejects it almost seemingly out of pure repulsion. She shoves him off of her and then gets up and inspects her crotch with a lamp. In this moment, the implication is clear that whatever she has down there, it isn't normal human genitalia. She might not be capable of being penetrated, but even if she is, she clearly finds the feeling of it repulsive. Shortly after this, she abandons the man altogether, running out into the woods to be alone. Whatever she had with that man, it did nothing for her. It just recreated all of the same miseries that she felt in captivity. Ultimately, she was still just an object. She never found an existential purpose or meaning in performing this feminine role, so she had to leave. It's apparent by this point in the film that the feminine form that her body takes is not one that she adopts as part of who she is. Her womanhood is exclusively exterior. Even calling the character the woman feels wrong, because she doesn't seem to internalize womanhood at all. Instead, she is alienated from womanhood, its positives, its negatives, all of it. Womanhood is not fundamentally about objectification or subservience to men, but it can sometimes be hard to divorce womanhood from patriarchal history and norms, which pressure women to be treated and to treat themselves as objects for men. When it comes to women, especially who have been victims of serious abuse, like in the case of sex trafficking, acclimating to a normal, healthy relationship with men can be difficult. And that's if we assume that a domestic life with a man will end up being normal and healthy in the first place. We don't actually know if the man who takes a liking to the woman under the skin was offering a good life for her. We don't know if he was predatory or not, or if he would have respected her autonomy or humanity. After all, domestic abusers can often appear at first to be offering a healthy or normal relationship, but set their partners up for an abusive situation that they can't easily get out of. Jumping into the arms of the first man who's nice to you is certainly a sign of serious trauma, and while I wouldn't say the woman is getting with this man because of trauma, it's apparent that her mind isn't capable of processing any relationship. Thus, it would be difficult to discern if this man is predatory or not. But the sad tragedy of this section of the film is that, even when being nice to her, he offered her, in the end, the same objectification that she had become conditioned to understand as her sole purpose in life. And so, even though she was less dehumanized, it was ultimately something she couldn't hold on to, because in a process of trying to find her existential purpose, she can't become a quote-unquote normal woman because she isn't a woman in the first place. She's not human. Womanhood is, instead, a shell that she can't escape, because it's a shell that dictates how people will perceive and treat her. The man was attracted to her based on her outward appearance and not her inner self. He didn't really know anything about her. Ultimately, he was objectifying her the same as anyone else. And this leads to the tragic ending of the film, one which I have mixed feelings about. The woman finally finds some semblance of freedom, escaping out into the woods to be alone. But in the woods, she encounters a man who presents as nice like several men before. Eventually, the man ends up chasing her through the woods with intent to rape her. When he tries to tear her clothes off, he accidentally rips off some of her skin, revealing her inhuman nature. He leaves. The alien now sees its outer woman's shell looking back at it. It can never be human. It can never be a woman. Whether this is a moment of sorrow or freedom is unclear, but what is clear is that, after ruining the ideal feminine image of this man had of her, he feels he has no choice but to kill whatever it is that he found. He sets the alien on fire. The alien dies in the woods. Your interpretation of this film will vary heavily depending on what you think gender is. Is gender real? Is it biological? Is it social? And if it's social, does that make it no longer real? If you believe that gender is fixed or biological, then you would have to agree that the woman under the skin is not and never was a woman. After all, she is not anatomically female. But if you agree that gender is a social reality rather than a biological one, then whether or not she is a woman is more ambiguous. What's clear, though, is that regardless of if she counts as a woman, she doesn't feel a strong connection to womanhood. Womanhood is, for her, an exterior process, an outer shell that she has no control over, but that other people perceive through the lens of images of femininity that they project onto her. What does female sexuality mean to someone who has no concept of femaleness? This gets at the primary idea of Under the Skin, which is the existential alienation that womanhood imposes on someone or something that isn't a woman. You don't opt into a gendered role. Gender is forced onto you, and often that force is based on how you're perceived at a glance. If you look like a hot woman, a patriarchal world will force you into whatever role befits a hot woman. Often, this is the role of a sex object. Thus, hot women are pressured into converting their bodies into a form of social, or sometimes even economic, capital. It should go without saying that the woman under the skin is very queer-coded. Her alienation from womanhood is reminiscent of queer experiences, particularly that of trans people. One could argue her experiences resemble that of trans men, who are categorized as female and forced into a feminine role that they feel no connection to, thus causing alienation from their social roles and bodies because of the dysphoria of being forcibly categorized feminine. On the other hand, one could also argue that her experiences resemble that of many trans women, who have to appear feminine in order to not be perceived as trans to avoid stigmatizing repercussions. This can cause intense pressure to be extra beautiful and extra feminine in order to minimize potential tells of transness. This can create a feeling of imposter syndrome, as though you may look like a woman but don't feel like a quote-unquote real woman. There are a lot of struggles for anyone who presents or is pressured to present as feminine. As well, I don't think it's possible to be trans of any kind without at least some degree of alienation from femininity due to the ways in which society objectifies and sexualizes the feminine. This doesn't make womanhood lesser than manhood, it's just different. But one of those differences is a lot of psychological work that has to be done to claim womanhood for oneself in the face of an often indifferent or even cruel patriarchal world. I think for people of any gendered background, a patriarchal world imposes a sense of existential anxiety. We don't really know why we are what we are, or what makes us who we are. We're conditioned to passively accept an image forced onto us from birth, and we're discouraged from experimenting or finding a place in the world that exists somewhere in the gray area between the extremes of masculinity and femininity. The tragedy of Under the Skin is that it's a story about a creature who was forced into the extreme of femininity without any chance to figure out what it wanted to be or what it really was. It was categorized female and lived as female, but never felt female. There's an important moment in the first act of the film. The woman is stalking a man outside a nightclub. A group of women, drunk and partying, walk by and intercept her. Their dialogue grows cacophonous, suggesting that the woman is being overwhelmed by this experience. These are real women, people who feel a kinship with one another over shared experiences of femininity, and they take her with them as though she's one of them. But she isn't. She doesn't understand what's going on. She feels no kinship. She feels no connection. She doesn't perceive herself as anything, let alone female. This sets a precedent for when the woman finally starts to explore her own sense of identity in the second act. She recognizes when she first looks into the mirror that she doesn't know what she is, but she does know what people are seeing when they see her. They see a human woman, something she knows she isn't. The thing about a controlling image is that nobody actually fits that image perfectly. Nobody is a perfectly accurate representation of the societal concept of the virgin or the whore, because these are objectifying roles which deny all possibility of autonomy, humanity, or subjectivity. In order for a woman like this to exist, she'd have to be hard programmed, and even then, these images are contradictory in nature, so it still wouldn't be exact. We do understand that the woman has autonomy, that she has some ill-defined sense of self-concept, and as such, she has feelings about the perception people have of her. She has no concept of how to live as her inner self, but she does recognize that she isn't the same thing as the image that people have of her, that she's more than just her exterior. She's alienated from womanhood, at least in part, because she's alienated specifically from the extreme of womanhood that has been forced onto her, the image of the whore. But I don't believe that she's seeking to become a woman. Instead, I interpret her actions in the second half as her trying to understand what she is based on what she sees. She sees a beautiful woman and understands that that is the role she has to play, so she's trying to figure out how to be that, because it's all she's ever known. So long as she wears the skin of a woman while being non-human, she will never be free. This is, to some degree, a metaphor for patriarchal oppression. As long as women exist in a patriarchal society, the patriarchal idea of what a woman is will always be constricting, and thus, womanhood can't exist in a context free from patriarchy. I don't think Under the Skin is meant as a radical feminist statement. Instead, it's a curious exploration of the effects of a patriarchal society on people coercively assigned a feminine role. This can be read through several lenses: sex work allegories, queer allegories, even neurodivergent allegories. But I think the textual story is more important than allegorical subtext. The woman's story reveals the false promise of the ideal feminine. First, it reveals the false promise to men. A beautiful woman who will gladly jump into bed with you without needing to give it much thought. That idea is a lie. It's a narrative used to manipulate men into doing things they otherwise wouldn't. And while it's easy to blame women for this narrative, the narrative is patriarchal in nature, and women are even more so the victims of said narrative than men are. Then, Under the Skin reveals the false promise of ideal femininity to women. Women who perform a domestic role of beauty, subservience to men, and sexual availability are promised a life of dignity, meaning, and comfort, and that the man will provide, protect, and sexually satisfy them. But this can just as easily end up leaving women in a position where they're stuck in a relationship that isn't good for them, just so that they can live out the image of traditional femininity. The image promises a false happiness, but it can never be reached. These are patriarchal versions of what a woman ought to be, and the woman lived these out but found no happiness in them. She never grew to understand herself, to feel comfort in her own skin. This is the ultimate alienation of womanhood. Not alienation from womanhood, but of it. The way in which womanhood can have an adverse effect on people when contextualized by coercion and societal oppression. The thing about existential anxiety is that it comes most often from being deprived of the ability to self-actualize. If you have no option to shape your life how you desire, then you begin to feel insecure about your role in the world, your value to yourself, and why you're even here. To find existential purpose, you need to shape your life in such a way that makes your life meaningful to you. Most people find some compromise on this, and gender forces a compromise on most, if not all, people. If your ideal self is contradicted by the rules and cultural norms of patriarchy laid out for you, then most people try to just find the closest thing to their ideal self that can exist within the context of patriarchy. If you can't escape womanhood, you just find the way of being a woman that comes closest to comfortable. The woman never found that state. because the patriarchal values of society were a great existential threat to her, and this culminates in the ultimate form of objectification, rape and murder. She ultimately is killed for her difference from the patriarchal norm. However, a big part of why this happened is because of how closely she resembled an ideal within patriarchy. Her beauty attracted unwanted attention because it fit a model of objectified desirability. She was ultimately treated like a whore, disposable aside from her sexual availability and beauty. Unable to escape this role, she never stood a chance of discovering her true self. The often disturbing narrative of stories like Under the Skin, to me, are sometimes hard to stomach. What is the point of conveying such suffering and misery? Well, I think that any story can be valuable, but for me personally, there's only really value in these sorts of bleak stories if there's something that can be gained from the experience that's more compassionate or activating. I don't want to come out of a film feeling hopeless or dejected, and despite its dark elements, Under the Skin is in many ways an uplifting movie, because it recognizes a major problem and calls attention to it. The existential threat that patriarchy poses to people, regardless of gender, but most especially women. A story like this becomes meaningful when you can recognize that this is all preventable. The world doesn't have to be this way. And while Under the Skin doesn't look too strongly at the systemic factors, it's clear that culture and systems of power play a large role in the narrative. She's under the control of male handlers. Men seek her out as an object of desire but don't seek to understand anything about who she is. The world has been conditioned to just passively accept her as a sex object, and she has been conditioned in the same way. When we see her in the mall, she both blends in and stands out. She blends in because nobody, including us, see her as inhuman. But she stands out because she's just off from everyone else. More sexual, more alluring, and in some small way, more alien. If the world didn't have such a misogynistic, objectifying view of women and of beauty, then maybe she would have stood a chance of actually having a life on Earth. But regardless, it is this misogynistic objectification that ends up weaponized to destroy her. She is forced into the feminine role and ruined by it. We could push for a better world. A better world for women, for men, for people who don't identify strictly as either, for everyone. The world we exist in now is an existential threat. It objectifies people by filtering them into categories that are used to control them and make them subservient to broader political and cultural projects. We're not all affected by patriarchy to the extremes seen Under the Skin, but we're all within a few inches of potential harm caused to us at any area of life because of how patriarchy is normalized in all areas of life. It was too late for her, but it's not yet too late for us. Thanks for watching. This video is an extension of themes I've explored in other videos, such as in my ongoing series discussing the original works of David Lynch. If you like this video and want to see more videos like it, consider checking out my videos on Lynch, most especially Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me and Lost Highway. I intend to cover more films soon, with ideas floating around for videos about The Truman Show, The Matrix, Ex Machina, Possessor, and Enter the Void. If videos on any of these movies interest you, let me know and I'll take into account what people seem to be most excited by. Lastly, this channel wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons over on Patreon. Patrons get their name in the credits and get to see rough cuts of longer video essays early. The current minimum is $1 and any help goes a long way towards improving the quality and quantity of videos like this going forward. Have a good day and see you in the next one.